Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. I wanted to do a quick addition to the last video I just did, and this is the possibility that the British could be handing over the Storm Shadow cruise missile to the Ukrainians. Now, we go back to the beginning of the war. And it was speculated that it could cause escalation between NATO and Russia, depending on what weapon systems were handed over to the Ukrainians. There was even debate about just how many javelins, in-laws, some of these smaller weapon systems to hand over to the Ukrainians. Now, obviously, if we fast forward almost a year, things have changed dramatically. Now we're talking about some of the most longest ranged, most advanced weapon systems now being handed over to the Ukrainians, such as the Storm Shadow. Depending on what variation of the Storm Shadow is handed over to the Ukrainians, that could have a range in excess of well over 300 miles. Export versions, 100 to 135 miles. But it's safe to say that those weapon systems, in all probability, have a much longer range than what is specified. So that would give the Ukrainians, and apparently the intent is to give the Ukrainians the ability to target more locations in Crimea. So what is going to be the Russian response to these Storm Shadows? How are these Storm Shadows going to be launched? The Storm Shadow normally is launched with an aircraft. It's difficult, or more difficult, for the Ukrainians to launch aircraft over Ukraine. Now, obviously, they would have standoff distance. They could launch the missile from western Ukraine and hit targets deep inside Crimea. Now, how would the Ukrainians deploy those weapon systems? And that's the big question right now. How? Are they ground launch systems? They could ground launch them. Obviously, it would give it, it would reduce the range by a certain amount, but nonetheless, these could be ground launch systems that are handed over. They could also be air launched. We're not sure completely how the Ukrainians are maintaining aircraft against the Russians. Probably with the help, again, of Western nation states. Other weapon systems, the Brimstone, Harpoon, have been transferred already to the Ukrainians and are being used against Russian forces. But again, the Storm Shadow would just be another more advanced, more longer range weapon system that would be handed over to the Ukrainians. Now again, how many of these systems would be handed over? Difficult to say. These are, I would call these strategic assets. Depending on how many have been produced, again, these missiles are $1 million a pop, or over $1 million a pop. So it's not like the British have massive amounts of these missiles in store. There's much less of these missiles, especially the Storm Shadow, than, say, JDAMs. So it'll be interesting to see just how many the Ukrainians get and how the Ukrainians then use these systems against the Russians. The Storm Shadow is an incredibly advanced system. Just like the Brimstone. Brimstone 2, much smaller, more of an anti-tank, anti-vehicle role. The Storm Shadow obviously can go after command and control buildings, can go after underground bunker complexes if needed. So again, giving the Ukrainians, I don't want to say a new capability, because I believe the Ukrainians do have limited capacity to strike deep within the Russian Federation. They've proven that. Now, do they have the specialized Broach warhead that would be on the Storm Shadow? Probably not. Again, the precision of the Storm Shadow, the stealthiness of the Storm Shadow, again, is going to give the Ukrainians kind of that upper hand, especially in attacking more targets in the Crimea. And then the question is, what do the Russians do? At what point do the Russians say, enough is enough? Enough is enough. And then what happens? What does that look like? How does that manifest itself? We don't know the answer to that as of yet. But again, another weapon system, the Storm Shadow, being handed over to the Ukrainians. More to come. Have a good day.